Hello. Today we'll be taking a look at Thomas Hill Jr.'s very excellent article called Ideals of Human Excellence and Preserving Natural Environments. This here is Thomas Hill Jr. He's an emeritus professor of philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill. An emeritus professor is in a sense retired, but still has, is attached to the university, still, contributes to university life and various things like that. He's also a past president of the American Philosophical Association, which is the professional organization for philosophers in the United States, the primary professional organization. There are several. So in any case, Hill has written this real excellent article, so let's get to it. And so keep in mind right at the beginning that Hill is going to focus in on what is the major question of virtue ethics. Right, so he starts off with this example where he says some person I know, right, some sort of wealthy eccentric person bought this home, and it had this, these beautiful, landscaping, nice lawn, pretty flowers, this, huge old avocado tree that shaded everything, and he just really, the person who bought the place didn't really care for plants so very much, and so he just cut down the whole lot and paved it over with asphalt, right? And you think to yourself, I mean, certainly it's within this person's right to do that, right? I mean, they do, he did own it, and perhaps the loss of, a fourth of an acre of grass and a tree or something like that is not really going to have any lasting impact on the world. But still, there's this idea of, like who would do such a thing, right? In Hill's words, what kind of person would do a thing like that? So again, Hill here is going to be focusing on the major question of virtue ethics, which is a question about how to be, not necessarily what to do. Of course, the two things are related. What kind of a person someone is will absolutely have an impact on the kinds of things that they do, and vice versa. The kinds of things that you do shape the kind of person that you are and become. But again, the primary focus for a virtue ethicist is on how to be rather than what to do. And because of that focus, virtue ethics has proven to be a little bit difficult to apply or difficult to use in cases of what we call applied ethics, right? Where we take some particular concrete issue and say, okay, we've got this issue to think about. Let's apply these broad ideas about moral theory that we've developed to those things. And so sometimes virtue ethics has very much of a problem. Even among those who really enjoy virtue ethics, who think it's a really profitable and a good theory of ethics, they tend to find it hard to imagine how to take the insights of virtue ethics and apply them to some issues in applied ethics, because in applied ethics it seems like the focus becomes what do we do, right? Or what do we not do, as opposed to how are we supposed to be, or something like that. And that's a challenge. Although again, there are increasingly very good examples of people doing just that, answering the challenge and saying, well, here's how you make a particular ethical issue more about how to be and less about what to do. And that's precisely what Hill is going to do here. So in addition to this really excellent article by Thomas Hill, if you're very interested in applying virtue ethics to specific issues, to specific applied issues, I would encourage you to look up Rosalind Hurst-House's very excellent article, Virtue Theory and Abortion. It's probably the most famous of these kinds of approaches to using virtue ethics in an applied context. And especially as later in the course, we're going to be reading a couple of other very famous articles about the ethics of abortion. This one contrasts with those fairly nicely because, again, it does take the virtues approach. So back to Hill. One of the things we want to consider, and what Hill considers toward the beginning of his article, is we have to consider what virtue ethics can do, or what it can give us, that other systems of ethics, like say utilitarianism, some form or other form of consequentialist morality, or even some form of non-consequentialist morality, like say Kant's system or perhaps Ross's system. It's important to see what virtue ethics can give us that these other kinds of systems can't. And so Hill gives us a couple of very memorable and very striking examples. Okay, they occur within the same half page of each other, and it really sort of it hits hard. These are well chosen examples. So the first example he supplies is of the Nazi who makes lampshades out of human skin, which is a thing that honestly, in fact, actually happened. There were Nazis who made lampshades out of human skin. And but just imagine such a Nazi who does this sort of thing, who did not themselves kill anybody to obtain the skins, right? Imagine them saying, "Why shouldn't I make lampshades out of it?" Right? Just imagine that for a second, and we'll sort of come back to the feature. But again, very striking example. The other very striking example that Hill brings up is, imagine somebody who's, some very obsequious grandson who, waits patiently through reading the will and everything, and then secretly, when nobody's looking, spits on his dead grandmother's grave. Okay. And again, this is a sort of shocking thing, but I want you to see what a couple of these two examples specifically have in common that's relevant to virtue ethics. First off, it's pretty clear that neither of these two are actually violating anybody's rights. Okay. I mean, so again, the Nazi who's dealing with the skins here. I mean, presuming if these people are already dead, right? We're assuming that you cannot violate the rights of the dead, right? That once you're dead, you don't sort of have any rights anymore. And so certainly there's that. It's not obvious in any case that somebody is violating any particular rights. It's hard to imagine what Kant or what Ross would say about what sort of duties are involved in a case like this. Nor does either act produce any bad consequences. Okay. Maybe some very remote kinds of things where it's like, oh, well, look, if it might be a bad example to set or something. But again, especially in the case of the man who spits on his grandmother's grave, nobody saw it, right? So there's no example to be set. There's no precedent. There's nothing, right? There's no consequences whatsoever that are generated from either spitting on the grave or not spitting on the grave. Again, it's this, it's a weird kind of a case. So because cases like this one, and again, you could probably use your imagination and think of many, many more, since neither of these cases obviously violate any rights nor have any obvious bad consequences, it's hard to account for the wrongness of either of those cases, and that's pretty striking. But of course, once the immediate reaction I think most people have when they hear of examples like this is, what kind of person would do such a thing? Right, and that's again where we start focusing on this central question of virtue ethics. It's more about just how to be rather than sort of what to do. Sometimes rights or duties and consequences just don't give us the whole picture or the most relevant part of the picture with respect to what we think is important in terms of morality. So virtue ethics does absolutely fill that gap. It does absolutely give us an avenue to saying what's so wrong about these kinds of cases is that the kind of person that would do such a thing is what's wrong with those cases. So aside from, or in addition to the fact that virtue ethics can fill in some gaps that we have in other moral approaches, Hill points out that environmental ethics in particular is a kind of opportunity. It represents a very fruitful place to get virtue ethics involved, and here's why. And some of this will involve a little bit of background in virtue ethics that you certainly may not have. So first off, it's hard to think about virtue ethics and talk about virtue ethics in terms of either rights or consequences, right? So let's talk about rights first for a second. Certainly, we've made a lot of progress in the rights of non-human things, right? I mean, certainly like animal rights, for example, has come a long way. I think in general, everybody now recognizes that animals have some kinds of needs, right? That they have interests, they feel pain, etc., and that it is certainly, I think everyone's on board with saying that animals should not experience any unnecessary pain, right? I mean, that's that's very clear. And so again, we've come to a lot of recognition that things other than human beings do have interests and can feel pain, that they are to some degree supposed to be considered morally. They have, in some sense, rights and interests. Now the discussion is over the extent of those rights and interests, not their existence, right? And so that's a kind of progress. But how far do we go with this, right? It might seem inevitable that eventually we'll be talking about, the rights of plants or of rocks or of, something. it may not be inevitable, right? The kinds of features, right, that animals tend to have, like nerve endings, for example, that allow them to feel pain, right? That have complex behaviors, right? That allow us to see that they have various kinds of needs of some kinds, or some you might say emotional needs, social needs, things like that. Uh, those things aren't, as far as we can tell, present in plants. And again, you might say, well, it's just inevitable that the trajectory will eventually take us there, but I don't think it's inevitable. Some branches of environmental ethics have explored the idea that it's perhaps whole ecosystems themselves that actually have rights, not necessarily individual members of those ecosystems. It's a very interesting idea, but it's very hard to work out. And maybe that will eventually go somewhere. Maybe that'll become part of the sort of popular moral consciousness. Maybe it won't. But in any case, it seems like there's some dead ends where our ordinary thinking about rights and about duties seems to stop somewhere and seems not to get us what we really want in terms of, again, just sort of preservation of the natural environment per se, as opposed to any particular organism that lives in it. So that's an historic trouble, right? An historic issue that environmental ethics has dealt with. And also, certainly there are consequentialist arguments about the preservation of natural environments. But those consequentialist arguments they don't seem to get the whole picture. So for example, I think it's very clear that when we say, okay, look, if we cut down all the trees, then eventually our atmosphere will become, non-sustainable for human life. We won't have enough oxygen, etc. You'll have ecological collapse, and that'll be like very bad for us, right? That's very clear, right? I mean, that a certain degree of environmental despoilage really will threaten our very existence. I think that's clear. And that's a very important consequentialist argument. I think if you think it's important that we all, don't kill ourselves through, greed and short-sightedness, that's certainly there. However, that's where a lot of those arguments stop, right? There's a sense in which, well, look, enough environmental despoilage is fine so long as it doesn't, lead to a great deal of harm to us, right? It seems not those sorts of arguments don't seem to get the entire picture. They don't seem to say that there's anything important about natural environments in and of themselves, and that's what I think most people who are concerned about issues in environmental ethics think that there's got to be, right? There's got to be some sense in which natural environments are valuable beyond what they can give us, right? This is the term that often is used as sort of anthropocentrism, right? That is believing that our interests are the only interests, right? I think again, there's some recognition that our interests aren't, or plausibly aren't the only interests. So again, any argument that only considers our interests is one that is a little bit too shallow, right? Doesn't quite give people what they really want in terms of virtue ethics or in terms of environmental ethics. And so again, if we're in a situation here where the discussion of rights doesn't quite seem to get what we want, and the discussion of consequences doesn't quite get what we want, is it at least possible, Hill asks, that what we're really looking for is something about virtues, about how to be, that might capture something about environmental ethics in a ways that discussions of rights or duties or consequences don't seem to do. And so Hill's approach is to fill in that gap in the following way, or to at least provide a kind of sketch for doing so. He says, the main idea is that, though indifference to non-sentient nature does not necessarily reflect the absence of virtues, it often signals the absence of certain traits which we want to encourage because they are, in most cases, a natural basis for the development of certain virtues. Okay. Generally, when somebody says my main idea is, right, you should take note of that, underline it a couple of times, and keep applying it to what follows after, because that's of course their main idea. So given that Hill's main idea is to say, okay, there's some traits that about how we relate to nature that are really important for human virtue, and that's going to be one very good reason to focus on the preservation of natural environments, is to again cultivate certain kinds of valuable traits in us that either are virtues or lead to virtues. So what kind of things could those be? So what is lacking in the person who, as he starts off the article, simply, paves over all the plans and says, yeah, I'm just happy you're not dealing with it. Okay. Just covers it all in asphalt. Actually, I think there was back when I was a kid, there was a Care Bear movie where some girl wanted to cover everything in concrete so she could roller skate everywhere. But of course, if you cover everything in concrete, you need smooth concrete for roller skating, not just concrete. Anyway, the whole plot involved a really giant plane that would drop concrete on everything, but like obviously they didn't pay any attention to how much concrete weighs, that sort of thing. Anyway, what sort of virtue is lacking in a case of this kind, right? And so again, Hill is going to give us a lot of different sketches, right, of what sorts of things might be there, and he's going to try and give some a fair shake to somebody who says no, that can't quite be it, right? And again, this is a sketch, right? This is a preliminary approach. It's a good investigation, and as such, this is really good philosophy. This is a really good article, but here I'm going to glaze over a lot of the details because I'm not going to just give you a blow by blow of what Hill himself does in writing in a very much more thorough and good way. As with most cases, in this case, the book is better than the movie. And so what I want to do is I want to point you to some of the major movements in this for your reference, so you can help to put things into context. But again, this cannot replace a very careful exploration of the reading on your own time. So he starts off by saying, is what's lacking in somebody who would say just pave over the world, is it that they don't appreciate their place in the universe, right? And he, discusses this from page 323 to 325 before moving to a sort of a related issue. He says, perhaps if it's not an appreciation of one's place in the universe, perhaps it's an appropriate degree of humility. Okay, we might imagine humility as a very classic kind of Aristotelian virtue, right? Somebody who has too great a degree of humility is self-effacing, right? They're unconfident, but somebody who doesn't have enough humility is arrogant or brash, right? I mean, and again, it seems like humility there's probably a mean there. There's probably a virtue between vices of excess and deficiency, and we can very much imagine that. And again, Hill explores how that applies to the preservation of natural environments. Following that, he says, is there this trait of self-acceptance, right? And he's going to define what that means in 328 to 29 as, again, a trait that leads toward virtue. Or also, he considers perhaps a sense of beauty. Okay, and again, this goes back to various kinds of Aristotelian approaches. The sense Aristotle mentions, if you'll recall, that the person, the virtuous person, is a person who sort of trains themselves, right, to love virtue. Okay, so the idea is that you can train yourself to see what's beautiful, what's appealing in certain things, and that's an important part of developing virtue, is to sort of train yourself to be attracted to the right kinds of things. And so is it a sense of beauty, of appreciation for things that is lacking in one who would simply pave the world over? That he explores on page 329 to 330. And then finally, he discusses another kind of what you might call an Aristotelian virtue, a kind of virtue of gratitude, right? It may be that there is a kind of, there might be an excess of gratitude. This might be a virtue that doesn't necessarily have an excess. I don't know. It might be hard to be too grateful for things, right? I suppose it's possible to imagine that. But certainly it's possible to imagine not being grateful enough. I think we all even probably know folks who maybe aren't grateful enough of what they have. And so maybe that's what's going on in the person who would simply pave the world over, is an insufficient amount of gratitude for what is there. And again, this is as a kind of virtue, as a guide to virtuous human behavior. These are all important. So again, I cannot replace the nuance of Hill's discussion of these points. I can give you a nice outline that can help you organize it, but that's really all. You very much have to sort of go through the sort of call and response that Hill goes through with these various ideas to really get the full sense of what's going on there. It's again, really outstanding article. Throughout Hill's discussion of these kinds of topics, from say 323 all the way to the end of the article, I also think that it's very helpful to consider that again, virtues are supposed to be the way to live the best kind of life, right? It's not just about having good character for the sake of having good character. Recall, having good character means being the best kind of person. It means living the best kind of human life. And I think once you start connecting that in with this kind of a discussion, I think it makes a lot of it makes a great deal of sense, right? If you really do want to live the best kind of life for a person, right? If you want to sort of live in the most satisfying way, if you want to cultivate, right, the most virtuous existence, then these are the kinds of things that you might have to consider. And these considerations add something to our discussion that goes far beyond just duties or rights or even consequences.